I'm going to show you something very important today. It's a hole in the very fabric of reality itself. Or at least what we call reality. But it won't look like it. You have to trust me. You're looking at it right now, actually. I think this is one of the most important shapes you'll ever see. And you've no doubt seen it before. It's the letter Z. But much like a key, if I turn it, I can unlock a hidden doorway. Because now it's the letter N. So which one was it? It is a silly question, but people ask it all the time. If I make the shape rotate like this, what you will notice is that it never stops being one or the other. It flips back and forth like a switch. There is no blurring in between. It is always either a Z or an N. And it flips like that. Once you notice this, you can take conscious control of it. I can make myself see the letter Z even after 90 degrees of rotation, but I have to fight myself to do it. Also, if I make this the top of the letter, as soon as the rotation reaches 90 degrees, my mind involuntarily flips the shape so that the top is over here. What we have to remember is that the shape we started with is both letters at the same time. But both letters at the same time is not something you ever have to see. So you don't, and you can't. You've also seen this before, and you didn't have to think about it. You recognized it was the letter A as soon as you saw it. In fact, the act of seeing it was the act of recognizing it. But this is also the letter A. I'm really not sure why. I don't think I could give you a straight answer if you asked for one. Perhaps you think that you could. Let's see if I can change your mind. This is also the letter A, and so is this, and so is this, and so is this. But there really isn't very much that all these glyphs have in common. Perhaps this is a bit mundane and unremarkable, but many a great thing has been found examining what we take for granted. So perhaps there are some hidden depths here. Apparently, a tremendous portion of this shape is noise. Just a tiny fraction is signal, and it's not easily located. For example, this horizontal. I can really put it anywhere. As long as it's there, it doesn't matter where. I can make it diagonal if I want, and it doesn't have to stay within the other lines. If we take it out entirely, we have a lambda, which is not the same letter, except it can be if I want it to. You can also use a dot instead of a line, which is not standard, but works just fine. So you don't actually need the line at all. A diagonal can be vertical if I want, and I don't have to use any diagonals if I don't want to. I can make this shape as wide or as narrow as I like. I can subject it to all kinds of distortions without any tangible loss of meaning. The letter has an elasticity, which can be played with. But if you ask 20 people to write the letter A, although no two would be identical, they would all have something in common with this. And the plasticity has limits. For example, this is pushing it. If you watched my video on hallucination, this entire situation will feel familiar. And it should. Once again, this is pareidolia. You can see this in this, for the same reason that you can see this in this. The cognitive flexibility which allows this to be this must also allow this to be this. There is no way around it. Let there be light is the first utterance of God in the Bible. Here is that typed in Times New Roman font. Here it is in Calibri, and in another font I like called Tostada. Here it is without vowels. Here it is with some of the letters scrambled. Here it is in cursive and in my messy handwriting. The same pareidolia which makes you see a face in a faucet lets you see the same meanings in very different shapes. The same thing can be seen in speech, and I began to notice it while editing these recordings. Sometimes I'll read the same line more than once. Sometimes I'll read the same line more than once, and I pick the one I like better. A kind of shining thread cuts through my voice when you hear me speak, and though the thread is in the sounds, it is not the sounds. It simply wears them, like clothing. It's just like how the meaning in this symbol wears many different shapes. And this is why if I put the words I'm speaking on the screen as I speak them, and slowly my voice... We should call this shining thread the logos, because logos means word, and the shining thread seems to be made of words. So let's name it that. Language was invented, or I'd rather say discovered, when human beings learned to use the process of our cognition, not accidentally, but consciously and intentionally. We learned that if we could be conditioned to perceive an idea in a vocalization, if we could name things, then we could use those names to make things happen. It is exactly the same discovery as that of technology, and the two probably coincided. Last time, we discussed the pareidolik nature of perception. We outlined exactly what perception is and how it works, and we went over how meaning is essentially a hallucination. On this basis, one could fairly assert that I am some kind of solipsistic nihilist. But this would be false, because I do not believe hallucinations are illusions. I explained last time that perception works like this. Your unconscious mind receives the massive information flowing in from your senses, and then basically graphs this information by painting a picture of the world. And we might say that the paint it uses are feelings and ideas drawn from past experience. We named these paints emanations. By far the easiest way to observe this process is with language. Only in language are emanations fully differentiated. The problem with some basic sensory category, like a color, is that it's very abstract. There are so many associations that none of them really stand out. A color can mean anything, so you can't project too much meaning onto it. The color red, my go-to example, could be lipstick or a bloodstain. It could be a rose or a stop sign. The color itself evokes what all red things seem to have in common, which in essence is this. This is something, but not something well defined. However, if I say words like pleasure, pain, peace, war, death, life, you begin to feel the connections. You begin to perceive essences in the words, because the essences are distinct. Here's an example that will demonstrate a little more clearly. Flowers and fruits, smiles and songs, and friends dancing in the summer sun. Compare that with storm clouds, murk, strangers, dark gazes, barking dogs. You didn't think about that. You just felt it. You could probably tell me all about the scenery, even though I barely described it. What is a dark gaze? Why did you know what that meant? You can't think about these things. It takes too long. You have to connect everything to everything else in your mind, and you have to see and feel the connections. If you don't do that, you won't make sense of the world fast enough. What language reveals to us is exactly the psychic process I've already described, but streamlined with artificial precision and exactitude. It takes a very, very specific meaning and binds it to a very, very specific sound. It uses the same mechanism as perception itself, but refines it, distills and weaponizes it. This is what I've been building up to. You're not seeing the world. You're reading it. The same way that you can break down this seamless band of color into a series of words, you can likewise turn this seamless band of vibration into this. This color reminds me of the sky, because the sky is this color. This song reminds me of my 2020 insomnia, because I found it at the time. This rock reminds me of a face. These three symbols remind me of a sound, dog, which reminds me of this. But in that last case, the connection is much, much stronger, because these three symbols only mean this and always mean this. Therefore, the symbols, the sound, and the image are so entangled that the connection is instant. Language had to use the same psychic mechanism as perception, because it uses the same sensory channels. How could it be otherwise? In this context, it's worth pointing out that in the mythic cosmologies of antiquity, the patron of magicians is always an inventor of writing. Hermes, or Mercury, was said to be the inventor of the alphabet. He was also a god of magic. The Egyptian god Thoth was the inventor of writing, and a god of magic. The Norse god Odin was the discoverer of the runes, and a god of magic. This is why we talk about magic spells. It's why we call bad words curses. It's why someone who can talk you into things is charming. In fact, the word charisma means a power bestowed by divinity, derived from the root charis, which means grace or favor. The word abracadabra is supposed to be derived from the Aramaic phrase avracadabra, meaning I will create as I speak. It is noteworthy here that in Genesis 1, God creates the world by speaking it into being. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The Gospel of John draws special attention to this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. The Hermeticists who wrote the Poimandres likewise likened the Logos to light, and asserted that the Logos was the Son of God. There seems to be something to this, to the idea that the world has a linguistic structure, or perhaps it's better to say, a symbolic structure, as long as we remember that symbolism is a language, and language is symbolism. It is true that language shapes our perception. However, this is only the case because your perception was already shaped like a language. And indeed, the structure of language is derived from that of perception. You project meaning onto these symbols. You hear what they've meant before. And you don't have to try to do it. It just happens. Every letter is an emanation, and these letters amalgamate into more complex emanations in the form of words. In Genesis, when God is speaking the world into existence, he begins naming the things he creates. After he creates Adam, he tasks him with naming the animals. This must have been important, because it's the first thing God tells him to do. I don't believe that was an accident. A name is a lightning rod for meaning. It is names which illuminate perception, names which map the world, which create contrast, dividing this from that. We ought to note that the first things which God names are day and night. The first act of naming was the creation of opposites and duality. When we name something, we program our perception. For example, if I put all of these colors on the screen, we can easily identify all of them as green. This is exactly the same as when we identified all of these shapes as the letter A. The name gathers these things together. It allows them to converge around a center. That is, it makes concentration possible. To concentrate is to focus, and that is precisely what a name allows you to do. Without them, the world is out of focus. Everything blurs into everything else. This is why in the tarot, the suit of swords is connected with the intellect. The intellect is verbal. It's the capacity to think logically. Logic, logos, word. Language, like a sword, cuts the world into pieces. It sharpens perception. It points things out and gives them edges. The name is, as it were, the capstone of a much larger structure, most of which is submerged in the unconscious. A structure which organizes and unifies a complex system of ideas, memories, and feelings. An organ of perception, which manages the interaction between the senses and the mind. A structure which exists adjacent to others, sometimes overlapping, and contained inside of larger ones. All that is to say, your perception is organized using a complex system of symbolic connections. The language we speak and the conceptual connections which it contains are a kind of low-resolution miniature model of this system. a kind of collective psychological operating system. The layout of this structure is what makes metaphors work. The dark gaze, which I mentioned before, is an example. A dark gaze is simply a gaze which feels like the dark, a gaze which is ambiguous and frightening. If we assume that perception really is based on a system of this kind, one in which things symbolically connect and converge around centers, this would make sense of the idea that you can read your dreams. If every image that the mind can conjure, along with every idea and every emotion, all relate and interlink in a meaningful way, like words in a language, albeit an extremely complicated language, we should expect that every image or sequence of images which the mind generates, no matter how accidentally, would be intelligible. In fact, if this model is correct, and it does have that look about it, then there is no qualitative difference between symbolic and verbal communication. Language is simply a very straightforward and constrained system of symbolism, and symbolism a very complex form of language. I don't think the word if is really appropriate here. Because perception works this way, we should expect even the most simple and elementary phenomena to be perceived as meaningful, even sounds and abstract mathematical patterns. And if that were the case, even something vague and frivolous like a song would be able to evoke strong emotions, just like this one is doing right now. You wouldn't like music if what I'm saying wasn't true, but you do. Until next time, thank you for watching, and be well.